UNODC estima que el 37% de los homicidios intencionales en México llevan sus armas, que no solo llegan a México, que luego estos que operan en México proveen de armas a Guatemala, a Honduras, El Salvador, a Belice y también al resto de la región. Entonces, uno de los temas que se debe discutir y que debemos pensar es en la porosidad de las fronteras. Solo Guatemala tiene 17 entradas oficiales y 97 informales, de las cuales se cree que la mitad son la entrada de AK-47, M16, AR-15, que por supuesto van a ir cambiándose de acuerdo a los controles. Y hay otro rol que también tienen los puertos, hay algunos muy famosos en Honduras, como la Ceiba, donde se cree que se trafican 100.000 armas al año, que si bien tuvieron que cambiar el modo de operar las rutas durante la pandemia por el cierre de fronteras, hoy ya están operando nuevamente con normalidad. Y si pensamos qué es lo que fueron haciendo las armas, estas que se van trasladando, y pensamos, por ejemplo, en el caso de El Salvador, lo que se llaman las maras, lo que se llaman las pandillas, fueron mutando de un esquema de control de territorio en los 80 de delito asociado al territorio, a expandirse y convertirse en pandillas transnacionales, y eso en relación a los carteles, en cooperación con los carteles de México. Por eso tienen la M por México. Bueno, pero esto está reforzado por el tipo de armas a las que tienen acceso. Por supuesto que con la demanda no es suficiente. Hay una cooperación entre crimen, policía, ejército y política. Y para ejemplificarlo, hace unas semanas, pocas semanas en mi país, murieron 24 personas por cocaína adulterada. Y fue un escándalo, ¿no? Fue un escándalo, pero desnudó una realidad de un barrio vulnerable donde la cocaína se vendía muy barata, donde las familias iban y morían en el camino llevando a sus familiares, y se vio una realidad donde gente trabajadora que se droga absolutamente todos los días, y la policía encontró al jefe de la banda que adulteró la cocaína en 2 horas, cuando estaba prófugo hacía más de 3 años, y eso para poder mostrar a los medios. Y cuando se comienza a desbaratar y a investigar, se encuentra que la policía formaba parte de la banda, y no solamente liberando el territorio, sino que utilizaban los autos de policía para hacer la recaudación de dinero, para distribuir la droga. Entonces era un territorio liberado con cooperación de la policía y liberado por la política. Entonces, para concluir, digamos, esto nos da la dimensión del problema y la necesidad de hacer cambios estructurales relacionados en nuestra región principalmente con la corrupción, y esto involucra a todos los países. Pero mientras discutimos y tratamos de combatir la corrupción, estamos convencidos que la demanda de México a las empresas de armas, que es una demanda inédita de un Estado hacia las empresas, es una posibilidad real y un instrumento real que tenemos de reducir el tráfico de armas. Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much, Pia. So appreciative for that perspective now from both what this looks like on the ground in Mexico and from the effects in the broader region. Next, we're going to hear from a representative for the organizations located in the United States who also filed a brief in this case. And for that, we're going to turn to Alla Lefkowitz.
Thanks so much, David. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Fantastic. As David said, my name is Alla Lefkowitz. I'm the Senior Director of Affirmative Litigation at Everytown Law. Everytown Law is the litigation arm of Everytown for gun safety. As David indicated, we were honored to, support this lawsuit, but also especially honored to work with our gun violence prevention partners on this brief, which included the Violence Policy Center, the Giffords Law Center to Prevent Gun Violence, March for Our Lives, Newtown Action Alliance, and Global Exchange. And I think they for a really powerful statement and a powerful brief. And so we decided, and we've heard a lot here today already about the detrimental effects of the defendants' actions in Mexico. And we decided to focus our brief on a legal concept that we have a lot of expertise in from our work, and that is relevant both in the domestic and international space, and that is the tort, the claim of public nuisance. So just, and I want to just give a little bit of a background on what exactly public nuisance is and why we thought it was so important for us to address this in the filings. Of course, public nuisance is a claim that Mexico has brought in this case. The public nuisance, in the simplest terms, basically is any kind of substantial or unreasonable interference with a right that is common to the general public, so to a lot of people, and it usually affects public health, safety, peace, comfort, and convenience. And in our mind, and I think the legal precedent supports this, that really is what gun violence can be. So and that's really what we focused our brief in. Public nuisance is a flexible call to action that is intended to address a variety of harms. For example, something as small as a bar or a restaurant that makes really loud noise and disturbs the neighbors, that could be a public nuisance. Then something like sewage or noxious odors that are being expelled from a factory can be a public nuisance. And most recently, public nuisance has been used with a high amount of success in the opioid litigation that's going on. And the claims there are pretty much that there are some corrupt pain management clinics that have been funneling opioids into the illicit market, and that certain pharmaceutical companies have been essentially facilitating that. And importantly here for our case, there was a recent case from a Massachusetts court that had adopted that reasoning. And so we believe that this kind of analysis and this kind of legal claim applies equally in the gun violence space. One thing I wanted to note is that in the past, there have been a number of public nuisance lawsuits against members of the gun industry on behalf of municipalities. And there are a number of, so for example, the city of Boston brought a lawsuit. This was back in 1999, 2000. City of Gary brought a lawsuit. City of Cincinnati brought a lawsuit. And in those cases that I've mentioned, the court held that when members of the gun industry facilitate the flow of firearms to the illegal market, that can constitute a public nuisance. So we really relied on that in our brief. One of the things that the defendants in this particular case have argued is that they can't be held responsible for these harms because it's ultimately a criminal or a bad person or that is that is committing the shooting. And what we explain in the brief is that may be true, of course, but when an actor like a company engages in conduct that is foreseeably leads to illegal conduct, that facilitates that illegal conduct, they can also be held responsible for for the harms that result from that conduct. So that's just basically the background of our brief, and I'm happy to answer any questions about it at the end. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alla. I'd like to invite Maria and Pia and Ala to all come on for the discussion portion. And first, I'd like to invite any of our panelists to respond to anything said by another panelist, whether that's to ask a question or build on the ideas. Well, I'll kick us off. Pia, I wonder if you can, if you know or have any thoughts about whether other governments might follow the Mexican government and try to bring a similar case.
No tengo el conocimiento que haya otros gobiernos utilizando esta práctica como antecedente. Si bien nosotros tenemos en América Latina una gran tradición en presentarnos en Amicus, si recurrimos, por ejemplo, a la Corte Internacional de Derechos Humanos, vamos a encontrar casos relacionados, por supuesto, con los derechos humanos, que tocan el tema de las armas, por ejemplo, pero está más relacionado a abusos policiales, a ejecuciones extrajudiciales, que en sí a demandar a alguna empresa o demandar a algún Estado por su falta de control en las ventas o por alguna política que pueda ser muy laxa o por la normativa que tiene. De todas maneras, creo que este proceso puede llevar muchos años. Va a ser muy interesante si finalmente la Corte acepta y pasamos a la etapa de investigación por toda la información que va a tener que revelar van a tener que revelar las empresas, donde se va a evidenciar sus políticas de marketing para atraer a los carteles mexicanos. Y creo que en ese proceso va a haber otros países que se van a ir sumando con ejemplos y van a ir reforzando el caso de esta demanda mexicana.
Thank you very much, Pia. A question that came in through the Q&A function, and please feel free to put any questions in that function on the Zoom, is about whether economists have studied the costs of gun violence in Mexico. I'll note that in their lawsuit, which I had shared in the Q&A portion earlier, the complaint document filed by the government, they outline the kinds of costs that specifically the Mexican government has incurred. And you can find that beginning on page 112 in that document. But I know, Ala, that Everytown does a lot of work about documenting the costs of gun violence. And I wonder if you wanted to speak a bit to that more generally.
You know, I'm not familiar with the numbers with respect to gun violence in Mexico. I do know that it's true that Everytown on its website does categorize and catalog the cost of gun violence in states around the United States, and focuses on the costs that come with any issue, whether it's police response, hospital costs, mental health treatment, victim services, the criminal justice system. There's really a lot of factors that go into determining the true cost of gun violence, and of course, the financial cost, is also separate and apart from the emotional cost of gun violence, which really can't be understated.
Thank you, Ala. Another question we have is about embassy help with the brief. This is directed to you, Pia. I think what Pia said was that the Mexican embassy in the United States was involved in that organizing process. Pia, I don't know if you want to speak more to that.
Sí, muchas gracias por la pregunta. Lo que hizo la Embajada de Estados Unidos la Embajada de México en Estados Unidos fue facilitar la relación con el estudio, porque el tema de Amicus es algo muy jurídico, facilitar la relación con un estudio de abogados que estaba trabajando pro bono para la presentación, y imagino, la pregunta ahí estaba relacionada también con la postura del gobierno de Estados Unidos. El gobierno de Estados Unidos, hasta donde yo leí, está intentando no colaborar con los medios, con las empresas. Ya ha habido algunos impactos reales en Estados Unidos, como la caída del precio de algunas de las empresas en la bolsa. Eso es algo muy específico. Y sí, la discusión legal va a estar en torno a la ley de inmunidad que tienen las fábricas de armas y a su extraterritorialidad o no. Creo que hay una ley del año 2005 que es en la que se amparan las empresas de armas, que por supuesto es reconocida en Estados Unidos y ha servido también, bueno, para el caso reciente que tuvimos de Sandy Hook. Pero lo que hizo la embajada fue contactarnos, nosotros nos contactamos con ellos también, personalmente yo estuve en diciembre en un evento organizado por México en el Consejo de Seguridad de Naciones Unidas sobre el tema de control de armas, y allí comenzamos a discutir la posible participación de las organizaciones de sociedad civil que estamos reunidas en esta red para poder constituirnos en Amicus.
Thank you, Pia. The next question is about the novel legal arguments that are presented in the amicus briefs. Ala, I don't know if you might, I don't want to put you on the spot here for other folks' briefs, but I wonder if you might, to the extent you have any particular arguments that you wanted to highlight in some of the other amicus briefs that were put in, if there's anything you'd like to speak to.
You know, I don't necessarily think that I'm in the position to speak on others folks' amicus briefs, but I think, you know, one of the things that were interesting and is an interesting part of this case is whether the Protection of Lawful Commerce and Arms Act, which is PLAC, which is the law, the federal statute that gives widespread protection to members of the gun industry, whether it applies in this case. And because the harms occurred, in another country, and the plaintiff is another country. So, I did not address that issue, but I don't know if any of the other panelists or others on this call may want to discuss that. And I know that'll be one of the major things that the court is going to be deciding.
Thank you, Ala. Yeah, I think that is going to be a major issue in the case. One of the briefs put in by legal scholars, addressed the question based on whether Congress intended for that federal immunity law to apply outside of the US to harms that were suffered outside of the US. And they survey information about around the time of the enactment of that law, as well as general background legal principles. And that brief concludes that Congress did not intend for it to have extraterritorial applications. So that federal immunity statute, they argue, is not applicable in this case because the harm suffered took place outside of the United States rather than within the US. If folks have any other questions for our panelists, please feel free to use the Q&A function. Well, in the interim, please ask any questions to the extent they arise. I'd like to note where we are at in the case. So all of those briefs had been filed by our panelists and others in support of the Mexican government. And the next stage will be the gun industry defendants who move to dismiss the case will have their chance to reply both to the briefs filed by these amici and also by the Mexican government itself, which also opposed the attempt to dismiss the case. And those briefs will be coming in next week on March 14th. So we'll see then what kinds of counter arguments the gun industry has and in what ways they respond to the arguments and issues that have been raised by our panelists here today. I want to thank again all of our panelists for joining us for this wonderful discussion. Pia, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Sí, no, quería hacer un breve comentario porque creo que es interesante y apoya lo que vos nos estás comentando sobre cómo sigue el proceso. Las empresas de armas tenían que responder mucho antes, luego de la demanda de México, pero solicitaron una extensión. Y para que la extensión sea aceptada por la Corte, tiene que estar en acuerdo en las dos partes. Entonces le preguntaron a México si podían otorgarle la extensión para dar la respuesta a las empresas. Algo que México acordó, dijo que sí, que no había problema. Pero ¿qué es lo que nos está mostrando el hecho de que las empresas hayan solicitado poder extender el periodo para responder que vence la semana que viene? Bueno, seguramente se vieron sorprendidas por los Amicus, por las distintas perspectivas que se presentaron dentro del Amicus, porque tienen que demostrarle a la Corte que también no solamente tiene que desestimar la demanda de México, sino que también tiene que destruir los argumentos de los Amicus. Entonces, eso hizo que las empresas pidieran una extensión y me parece importante porque ese es el rol que tenemos que cumplir todos nosotros y ese es el aporte que podemos hacérselo cada vez más difíciles a las empresas. Era ese comentario para completar lo que vos estabas diciendo, David.
Thank you so much, Pia. I think that's right, that the issues and the complications and the overall context that the briefs put in by the civil society and government groups have been really important in showing the scope of the problem. And I think bringing the lie to the suggestion that it is narrow or a specifically Mexican problem. It's a regional problem. It's an American problem writ large. So thank you for sharing that. One question coming in was about how the specific defendants to this suit were chosen. I, at least, haven't been privy to any of the discussions of the Mexican government about how they reached that, but I can say from the documents that have been filed is that they highlight ways in which the specific gun companies engaged in a more egregious conduct or are more responsible for the scope of violence suffered in Mexico. One example there is a company called Barrett, which produces 50 caliber sniper rifles. These weapons are tremendously powerful offensively. They've been known to be able to take down helicopters, and they can be used to shoot with accuracy from over a mile away. So those weapons have been used particularly by cartel violence, by the cartels in acts of aggressive violence, and the destructive power is really, truly disturbing. Let's see. I believe that is all of the questions we've received. So I want to thank again all of our panelists for joining us today. I want to thank our hosts for this fantastic event and to thank you all for joining us.
Muchas gracias a todos y a todas.